Hello, everybody, and welcome to Benjamin Tischer and Eric Heist. We're going to be discussing Candy Factory, a show that's currently on view at Keijsers Koning. You can see it, of course, behind me, and you'll see it throughout this interview. Benjamin Tischer is the owner of New Discretion and representative of the Genesis BREYER P-ORRIDGE estate. Eric Heist is an artist who worked with Genesis since 2000 on various projects together, and we'll kind of talk about what they've done and how they got to this last project together. And without any further ado, if you guys could introduce yourself a little bit, get a little bit of background, that'd be great. Benjamin, if you want to start.
Sure. So, hi, I am Benjamin Tischer. I have worked with Genesis, first organizing her archive for the Tate, which was acquired back in 2008, and then representing her as an artist with the gallery Invisible Exports for 10 years before we closed that physical space. And now I am called New Discretions, and I work with a number of estates, including Genesis.
I'm Eric Heist. I started working with Genesis around 1998 when I met her. I'd seen her perform before that, before she was at Psychic TV. So I had a little bit of background, but learned a lot more about her after I met Genesis.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank you both for the opportunity to show the work. It's been a real pleasure to introduce it, to see it, to kind of live with it in the space. And what I thought was really interesting is, you don't see a lot of collaborations between artists, and it's always surprising actually when it works. And what I thought was so interesting is that you, Eric and Jen, when you both met, it was kind of interesting that you were both interested on the same platform almost, and that the approach and maybe even the distance that you could then have became much more clear about your kind of the fixation of the, I would say, the body, or at least the flesh. I mean, there's a very visceral reaction that you have to these paintings, even though you don't know quite what you're looking at. And especially with the images that are in the show, ambiguity is, of course, top of the chart. We are here, we can kind of see on screen. So we're looking at silk screens that are based on photograph that Jen took. And I do have some questions actually to you, Benjamin, about if you know a little bit about how she took them. I mean, we know it's a Polaroid, but there was sometimes a kind of a ritual to it. I'd be curious if you could kind of give a little bit more background to that.
Sure. Well, I will just start by saying that Genesis always followed the zeitgeist. She didn't really care what strategy she used to get her ideas a platform. She started off as a performance artist and was making little objects, kind of like Cornell boxes, using tampons, among other things, and had her first retrospective as far back as 1976 at the ICA in London. That show was kind of notorious. She was dubbed Records of Civilization, along with Cozy Fanny Tootie. It was kind of the equivalent of the Mapplethorpe scandal here in the States. And at that point, she kind of decided that the art world was too conservative and switched over to music. Throbbing Gristle premiered with that ICA retrospective. Going on to Psychic TV. When I met Genesis, it was in '99, probably about the same time that Eric met her. And she was, at that moment, kind of burnt out on music. And this is the moment in New York, in Chelsea, when there were, 3,000 people in the streets of Chelsea. Like, it was a moment in time that we will never see again. But it was just huge crowds. Contemporary art was once again kind of a mainstream platform. And I think this, along with meeting Eric, kind of launched her back into the art world. And also, interestingly, the first time she was appearing in the commercial art world. Up until that point, everything had been performance and institutional spaces. And this work premiered at Team Gallery. So that was, a quite interesting shift for her, I think.
Well, I think it probably also for you, Eric, it was comfortable where you guys met, which was Momenta. And for those of you that need a little bit more background about some of these words that we're saying or ideas that we're illustrating, I'll provide it in the bio. And Momenta was a great non-for-profit organization that started in Philly and eventually moved to New York City. And how long did Eric?
It started in '86 in Philadelphia.
It's always amazing. And it was really at the forefront of kind of experimental arts and kind of keeping us at our toes. And that's where you two both met, right? At the
Yeah, Jackie had met my wife at the time, Laura Parnas. And I think Jackie saw some of my work that I was doing, these sugar-coated body prints that were overlaid on these sort of chat room conversations. And that's the work that Jen first saw. And she was like, oh, I love sugar, so these are great. And I think kind of Jen intuitively understood the symbolism that I was working with the sugar being a kind of a connector between people, between different identities of people. And Jen was always trying to kind of cross these lines and mix them up. And I think that's where we understood each other pretty well.
Yeah, I always find it interesting. It's a lot of people are like, oh, it's pushing boundaries. And I'm sometimes wonder if it's more questioning boundaries. And it'd be like, oh, why are we imposing this? Why are you imposing these rules onto me? If it's all under a consensual umbrella, why should you, not allow me to go past these rules that you set about or we set about as a society? And I think that that's so interesting about this particular show, because there is this ambiguity, there is this attraction you have to it. I mean, I think initially it's also the color. I mean, these things just really melt your eyes. It's amazing. They're sugar for the eyes, so to speak, and they have such individual identities, and at the same time, when they're in a series, it also kind of just becomes this bombardment. But it's interesting to see the audience here kind of love that color and then kind of have this reaction to it that's like, why am I attracted to it? Then they're like, oh, what am I looking at? Is it a buttocks? Are they breasts? And then you have to tell them their knees and they don't know quite what to do with that one. And it just is like, okay, how can I be attracted to flesh? And I love that you guys kind of were able to put it in such a context that, it tastes sweet while it goes down, and then we don't really know what we're attracted to. And we leave here feeling a little bit, just like our mind expanded just a little bit more, it just went a little bit further than when we started. And I love seeing that with people. I mean, I think that's something new, at least, also for what we know of Jen. Sometimes that's much more, out there in your face, that this is probably one of the more subtle projects that both of you kind of have done. And I'm curious, I mean, there was, of course, the show has been traveling. It started with Benjamin in New York at a temporary space. And we'll talk a little bit about the different formats it's taken, which is kind of interesting. And then it went to the Galveston Artist Residency, which is here in Texas. And then, of course, it came here.
If I could jump in there, it actually, the very first iteration of this body work, which is the kind of third group of Candy Factory paintings, it originally premiered at Canal in Brussels, which is a space associated with the Pompidou Center. An arm letter, the artist curated a selection of these. And that was right after COVID and the first premiere of this work.
Do you remember how it was kind of set up? Was it in a series or were they individual?
They set them up in a linear fashion.
It's funny. Yeah, it's so in here we have this kind of grid work, and it's interesting that people then have this shock reaction when they see him, more individually or singularly, and then it's kind of like they kind of go back and forth. And it's been, what I liked about your show in New York as well is that you really played with the idea of grid and kind of breaking that pattern, because it is important to know that this is a series that was very methodical. And we see, for example, the knees, and they start out let's say in a frontal position, and they turn 1/4 like a clock, and it just goes and rotates it over and over as the different colors kind of are introduced. But what I liked about the New York series was that you broke it up, so you kind of had this missing point or missing reference, and kind of kept you on your toes. And it was an interesting rhythm, and also the space was rougher, or at least the concrete, so you had that kind of harsh setting. But that was something you both came up with, right? This kind of rhythm.
Yeah, we worked together on that. Another thing that Genesis had told me, actually referring to the first Candy Factory works rather than these, was that she kind of equated these as, potential sex partners. So she would say, these pieces, they're a grid, they work as a group, but they are like sex. It's great with one person, it's great with two people, it's great with six people. So I always thought that was like a very Genesis quote.
That's a good one.
That is a good one.
Yeah, I remembered when we did the show in London at Center of Attention Gallery, we brought a piece that was partial. It was this peephole piece that had been shown at Team. It was like a living room, and you look through the mirror, and then there was an image of penetration behind that with a dildo. And we were missing the back part of it, of the dildo image. So Jen's recruited a couple of young lads, pasty young lads, and said, would you guys get behind this piece, and we'll put some curtains up, and we'll set up kind of a bed, and you just kind of go at it for the duration of the
viewing.
So kept them busy. They were glad to do it. I mean, Jen was so good at convincing people to do things.
Well, makes this collaboration also so interesting, because I mean, she's such a force to have worked with and have seen. I mean, it was really it's interesting to constantly see her talk in interviews. She really loves to be in this kind of control of the dialogue. So for you guys to then actually be able to meet on one platform to produce these, 3 projects, it's kind of amazing. It's really impressive. I mean, how did you experience it? I mean, you mentioned prior that you kind of kept it as to, you would receive the images and then you would do the active screen printing. So there was kind of a separation of tasks. Was that kind of
we didn't really work together, like in the studio together so much. Jen would have ideas, and had the photographs, and these photographs were, they're incredibly beautiful things. How she got them, I don't know. It's just, I've tried doing Polaroid work, and the subtlety, beauty of these images, I don't know how she did it. But I think Jen had her own rituals for doing things.
Yeah.
Like Ben said, I think it changed. It was sort of whatever felt right at the time. But these images felt like they were from a particular time and a particular place, and some sort of a ritual that was enacted.
These the model in these Polaroids, the specific Polaroid set, is the world famous Bob, who was a burlesque performer in New York around the change of the millennium. Genesis was very much involved in that scene through her partner, Lady J. Lady J performed with Black Lips, with Anthony, among other people. So like she ran around with the world famous Bob, Scott Ewald, Juliette List-Muse, and I know that they would document themselves to like the 9th degree with Polaroids, and then they started getting other people in to do Polaroids with them as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the Polaroids have these kind of highly contrasted images, and they're very soft at the same time, which is kind of amazing because it's, I mean, it's harsh lighting, so the skin tones kind of flare out, and any deep shadows, it immediately becomes like a crevice. But I also thought it was interesting. We do have some works on paper in the back, and how different each of the silk screens feel. That I thought was interesting. So they do lend, you know, themselves to the act of silk screening, which is, granted, it's a very mechanical, you know, movement. I think what's interesting is that they each have these unique feelings about them, and even within the different materials that they're done on. So the paper, they're very soft, and I mean, of course, it's also the colors that Eric, I think you chose them at the end. And you know, when you compare them to, for example, the canvas, where it's the contrast is just, it's harsher, you know, the paint kind of like emerges out onto these canvases. And no, I really am always admiring the kind of the uniqueness of they feel like very much of a moment that just you're having a meeting with, and that moment is shared with you, which I guess is a nice allusion to the, you know, the sexual partner. It's kind of that exchange is there. I do have a question for you, Eric. With how was it? I mean, you had 2 shows back to back, even though it's the same series, it was a different setup and different experience. How was it for you to kind of see them at Galveston Artist Residency? You know, it was a complete series. I mean, you guys set it up like almost like a from beginning to end. And here
there was a systematic way that they were made, and that was reflected probably most directly in the Galveston presentation. The first ones that were made were 22-inch square pieces, a set of 30, not the very first, but of the work that was shown there, based on that knee image that you showed earlier.
You know, everything you've done from that.
Yeah, well, there were 30 in that piece, so it was 3 lines, 10 each, going through every combination between the foreground and the background, foreground image and the background solid color, just through the 6 colors, the 3 primary colors and 3 secondary colors. So, and then it moved through that whole thing in a sequential manner. And then there was another 6 that were 33 by 33 inches, 4 that were 44 inches square.
I always have to laugh because you're so systematical. Like also when we set it up, we were just like, we're gonna go this and that. So it was kind of fun to do it here. I mean, I had to kind of shake you up a little bit. And I will say, I mean, once we got it on the day of, there was a kind of rhythm that we both kind of caught. And the next day we saw a few that just didn't catch, so we kind of had to switch over the colors. But for me, it was very important in this particular show also to kind of look at them individually and
yeah, I think like my practice in the studio is pretty rigid in the way I go through it. But then like when we were installing on the Bowery, I think like Justin was there were a couple of people that were there and they all had input, and and Benjamin, and so it was very different. It was whoever was there, and I love that process, that it gets out of my hands a lot.
That's great. I mean, and Benjamin, for you, how is it to put shows like that together? Because I mean, you have such information, you know,
well, it's interesting because like, you know, it's collaborative work, but in the end, it's also a collaborative hang. Mm-hmm. So like, I do love how fluid Eric is with how the work is presented. And it's been interesting because most of the people that have acquired works have ended up with individual pieces. I really would have thought that more people would choose sets just because they are kind of constructed to go together.
Well, and they look good together. You know, it's really kind of impressive to stand in front of a wall like that. I do have to ask, Eric, and I'm just curious because there are some direct relationships, of course, word-wise and visually, and the act of silk screening is the Warhol factor, and how much that came into play with the creation. Because I've had a few people ask, and besides the obvious link, I mean, I'm just curious if that was at all an idea or a factor that played into it.
Yeah, from the very start. I mean, Jen was one that came up with the title Candy Factory, putting together Candy Darling and the Factory and Factory Records as well. So that kind of crossover between music and art, that was part of it.
Yeah.
And also gender, gender non-specificity,
Sure.
also part of it.
Well, it's actually
Genesis always acknowledged her heroes, the people that influenced her. And I don't think it was until she moved to New York that she really became enamored with Warhol. But even more than Warhol, she was obsessed with Candy Darling and Twiggy, especially. Like, she really adored Twiggy.
Well, guys, I just want to say again, thank you so much for your time on this. I really appreciate you guys giving me a little bit more background on just the whole setup it is. And again, thank you for the opportunity. It's been a delight to have these in the space. They looked absolutely amazing. And that, with no further ado, I appreciate it and wish you guys a good day.
Thank you, Bart.
Thank you to Benjamin Tischer, Eric Heist, and the estate of Genesis BREYER P-ORRIDGE. Candy Factory is on view at Keijsers Koning.